Good morning, everyone. I'm always so privileged and honored to come and share with you what God has poured into my heart. And as I've been reflecting, it seems like I've been doing a lot of reflecting lately over these past couple of months, but my mind went back to a incident where I learned this really huge spiritual understanding, this really great lesson in life. And it was back in the early 90s. And at that time, it was a terribly busy time in my life. I was working full time at Monsanto. I was running a business. I was married and caring for four children and a husband. And it was so full. And in the midst of all of that, not with me doing any searching on my own, I made this discovery. You see, I had employed this particular seamstress to help me out with one of my signature best-selling dresses. My business was I was selling African wear at that time, and so I'd hired this lady to do because I couldn't keep up with the orders. I had hired her to do this work for me, and I wasn't even looking for anything wrong, but God is so amazing. Always through my life, God will always bring me things that I don't even have to search for it, but He allowed me to have this understanding. So I was given this understanding that the woman that I had hired to make those dresses was not only making dresses for me, but she was making them for herself. And when I would leave to go to work, she was selling her dresses out the back door as her own. And of course, I was devastated. And to some, it may not seem like a big deal, but it was for me because, there's just some things I don't know. I'm just that kind of person that I'm not going to deceive you. And of course, I feel I was being deceived and I really didn't even know how to approach it. And at that time, I was going to Bible fellowship and I had this amazing prayer partner, Sister Willie Dale Beard. She was an amazing person. She could just pray fire down from heaven. And she had shared with a minister at the church that I was attending at that time, Reverend Diane Anthony, what was going on in my life. She was concerned about me and she wanted to get her opinion, so she shared it with Reverend Anthony. And we had this event. It was some type of outdoor event. I can't remember what it was, but I remember Reverend Anthony coming up to me and she said, Myra, she said, what God has for you is for you. And then and I want to add this because I just saw this morning. That exact same phrase was on Facebook this morning. Motherfoot, thank you. She posted this and she said that, it says that what God has for you is for you. And that God is not going to deliver your mail to someone else's house. I really like that. God's not going to deliver your mail to someone else's house. But anyway, going back, Reverend Anthony instructed me to read the story of Joseph. That was it. That was all she said to me. And she walked away. She said, what God has for me is for me. And she said, read the story of Joseph. I'm like, I'm thinking to myself, I mean, I thanked her, of course, but I'm thinking to myself, look, I done read that story a buku times, but I was obedient. And when I went home, I read the story of Joseph, starting at the 37th chapter of Genesis. Oh, God, you are so good. You are so good. And as I read that story, I realized that story became a life-changing event for me. The level of spiritual understanding God gave me in that, it was more than what God had for me. It was for me. I realized I didn't have to worry. I realized that God had a plan for my life. And it was just such an assurance that came into me. And even that thing that the devil would mean for evil, God would always use it for my good. It was amazing. So the scripture this morning is coming from Genesis 27, 1 through 4. Okay, actually, that scripture is going to be Genesis 39, verse 2. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, serving in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and the Lord made everything he did successful. That was a defining moment for me that the Lord is with me. And the Lord was with Joseph. All that Joseph went through, the Lord was with Joseph. And the Lord was with me. And the Lord is with you. The Lord is with you. That was such a defining moment. Not only what God had for me was for me, but that everything that God has for me, that He has a plan. I realized just like Joseph, God had a particular plan for Joseph. And we all remember that story of Joseph. Yeah, it's an amazing story about a young man. He was 17 years old, and God had given him a dream. And of course, he had shared this dream with his brothers, and his brothers didn't like him. The father didn't too much care for the dream, but Jacob was very fond of Joseph. And you all remember that Jacob had made Joseph this incredibly wonderful, colorful coat. And his brothers did not like that at all. They knew that he was favored by his father. And so as Joseph's life continued, we realized that Joseph went through a great deal. He went through a great deal as a young man and at the hands of his brother. You know that 25% of the book of Genesis is about this man named Joseph? 25%. You know, and those 5 words stood out with me so much. The Lord was with Joseph. You know, even in the creation, when God was creating the world, the universe, as a matter of fact, and in Genesis 1:16, he said, he used these 5 words after all the creation, and he said, and God created the stars. But in the book of Genesis, he devoted 25% of this book to Joseph, the most Christ-like figure or character in the Old Testament. And we have so much to learn about Joseph. The story of Joseph picks up when he was about 17. And you know what? Let me tell you a little bit about Joseph. Joseph came from a really dysfunctional family. Before his dad, Jacob, he was a real mess before God got a hold of him. I mean, he was a con artist. He was a trickster. You know, he was just a hot mess, kind of like we are before God got a hold of us. Thank God. And Jacob had an uncle by the name of Laban, who was just as slick as he was. Now, Jacob's mother had a few tricks up her sleeve as well, and she was one of the reasons why Jacob ended up with his slick uncle Laban's house. Glory to God. And then in the midst of all that, in his mid-teens, Joseph's mother died. Rachel died, and he was going through a lot at this time. And he lived in the midst of some really wicked brothers, ungodly brothers. So this was the dysfunction that Joseph had to deal with. But yet and still, the Lord was with him. You know, I began to realize that, Joseph, just like myself, had to learn to express his God-given differences. The one thing that I realized that Joseph was different from his brothers and his family. He was very different. And even when I think about my life and how God created me, even though it was a struggle at first, this difference, I just didn't want to be different. I wanted to be like everybody else, but I had to come to that understanding that God had made me just a little bit different than my brothers and my sisters. And so I remember reading this, and this just so comforted me. Romans 12:2. Be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable, perfect will of God. The child of God must be different. Joseph had to explore his God-given dream, just like I did. God gave him a dream, and even though he didn't understand the details of that dream, he had to move forward in that dream, and God needed for him to move forward in that dream. And then I began to realize this. that the dream that God has planted in Joseph and the dream that God has planted in me and the dream that God has planted in you, it will be manifested. And we have to trust God even when we don't understand it. You know, I begin to realize Joseph didn't have a map in this, but he continued. Joseph did not have a map. And, you know, I begin to think about that. Joseph didn't have a map. He didn't have a plan. You know, sometimes I realize that God doesn't give us specific instructions. He doesn't give us, okay, after he gives you the vision or if he gives you the dream, he don't say step 1 or step 2, step 3, and this is going to happen and that's going to happen. No one could have ever told Joseph. If God would have just laid out the whole plan, now look, Joseph, I know I gave you this incredible dream and I know you don't understand the fullness of it, but you know, if God allowed Joseph to understand the fact that, look, your brothers are really going to turn against you, they're going to throw you in a pit, you're going to be sold into slavery, you're gonna end up in prison. You're gonna end up in Egypt, far away from your dad, and you know you love your dad, and you know you love your brother Benjamin. All of this, if God had just laid it all out, I don't know if he'd have been in for that one. I don't know if he wanted to buy that package. Even back when I was in the 90s, when I was just going through this great exploration of who I was and what God had for me to do, I know that even with this understanding of what God gave me, that I know you're with me, God, and I know you have a plan for me. I know you're giving me a dream. I know this, but I still don't know if God would have laid out the plans for me from A to Z that I would be willing to take the first step. It was hard enough when I didn't know to take the first step. Even when my spiritual father, Apostle Cledell King, prophesied to me and told me to my face in front of the whole congregation, Myra, I see you in foreign land. I see you preaching the gospel. And I looked at him like he just grew some horns and turned purple with pink dots all over his face. Because I'm like, no, I'm shaking my head. No, 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 no. You couldn't possibly be talking about me. You cannot be talking about me. But he was. Even though I rejected it, but God had a plan and he had a dream just for me. So then I began to think about Romans 12th chapter. I beseech you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, that you present your body a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And I began to realize this principle. Presentation plus transformation equal realization. Presentation plus transformation equal realization. My presentation, I had to surrender to the will of God, just like with Joseph. Even when we didn't understand, even when Joseph didn't understand, when I didn't understand, and you won't understand, I had to surrender to the will of God for my life. And then when I began to think about the transformation, here I am, God. So that transformation is what was on the inside of me would be manifested to the outside. See, when Apostle Cledell King told me what was on the inside of me, I wasn't even willing to explore it. I didn't want to think about it. I'm like, and I had a problem with that because I had a problem. Why did God even choose me? But boy, when I allowed God to transform me, he brought out what was on the inside of me to the outside of me. And then the realization is that, God, I know that I'm going to understand your perfect will. Even though I may not get it now, I'm going to understand it. That's the realization of the perfect will of God for your life. And the next thing was, I had to endure the God-given difficulties. Joseph had a lot of difficulties in his life. He had a lot of difficulty from the time that God gave him the dream until the time the dream was manifested when he would be second in charge of all of Egypt. A lot happened between the pit and the palace. And a lot happened for me from the 90s up until now. And a lot will happen to you when God has given you a dream, when God has given you a vision. There's that space in between here and there. It's that place in between the giving of the dream, of the giving of the vision to the manifestation of it. The one thing I had to realize that there was an expected end. When Joseph, and when you get to the 50th chapter of Genesis, And Joseph finally was confronted with his brothers. You know what? And when he told his brother, he said, that thing that you meant for evil, God used it for my good. See, we don't realize on that road from here to there, on that road from the dream to the manifestation of that dream, that God has a plan. And it may not look like the plan that you have. Now, truly, I would have never chose the path that he had for me, but he chose the path that he had for me, and he proved himself to be great in it. And even though I didn't understand it, I knew all along that the Lord was with me. That the Lord was with me. Romans 8:28 reminds me. And we know that all things work together for good to them who are called according to his purpose. Whenever man rules, God overrules. Whenever man rules, God overrules. You got the dream? Lord knows I had a dream. I had the word from God, but there were times and there was years where it appeared that dream wasn't about to manifest itself. That dream looked like it was going every other way but from the way that it was supposed to go. Oh, but I tell you what, I realized that even when Joseph was in that pit, God was energizing him. Even when he was in prison, God was energizing him. Even though he was lied by Potiphar's wife, God was yet energizing him. And I know he did that through me, throughout every difficult situation, throughout every illness, throughout every challenges, throughout every pothole, every pit hole, every lump and bump in the road. The Lord was with me, even though at times I had to scratch my head and say, God, where are you? But I knew all alone in my heart of hearts that the Lord was with me. And even though we're going through these changes that we're going through with this COVID-19 virus, and now all this racial injustices, or unrest, I should say, the Lord is with all of us. The Lord is with us. You know, in all of this, we need to realize God is just showing us. God is exposing our hearts. And you know, I think about the exposure part when God is doing rehab. And when you're doing rehab on a house, I like those shows on HGTV, Fixed This House and Flipped This House. And I love to see rehabs. But when they're really going to rehab a house, they take a house down to the wires, down to the stud, and you can see the exposed wires. But even in all of that, when God is exposing the wires, he's exposing our hearts. He's exposing our hearts. And you know, sometimes it's hard to really see us, just like it's hard to see behind that wall. And sometimes a builder don't even understand when he's rehabbing a house what he really going to get into until all that other stuff is removed. When all that stuff that he doesn't need anymore is removed, then he can see really what's wrong with the structure and even what's wrong with the foundation. And so in all of this, and all that we're going through, know that God cares for you. Now this song was a song that was just ringing in my heart today. His eye is on the sparrow. Why should I feel discouraged? And why should the shadows come? Why should my heart be lonely and longing for heaven and home? For Jesus is my portion. My constant friend is he. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches you. Amen.